I think I want to write another book, and that's where I want to begin. So I think that this is going to be chapter one. In the book that I want to write is about the feelings of innovation or the feelings of entrepreneurship, or maybe it is being a PhD. I can't disentangle these things, but there's this basic principle in life that we know about. And I think that this is based on a vast amount of research. Um, and this basic principle, and it's sort of the foundation of finance, foundation of economics, is that for investment decisions, we take a little bit away today and then we put it away for tomorrow into something. And then we decide what that something is. Hopefully, you make a good choice that will be fruitful in the future. And I think that almost all educational pursuits, almost all innovation pursuits, almost all entrepreneurship pursuits follow this basic path where you take a little bit away of what you currently have and then you reinvest it into the future. And this causes all sorts of feelings. The popular belief that a lot of people believe is that these acts, getting an education, becoming an entrepreneur, doing something innovative, all feels like a glorious thing. And from the macro perspective, maybe from, somebody running a country, for example, it is a good thing. But what we forget is that in the course of all of these particular, in the course of actually doing it, is that you can choose poorly. And this causes a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of ambiguity. You don't know whether you're actually making the right choice, whether you're actually going back to school or getting an education. You don't know whether if you're doing something that's appropriate, if you're innovating in a company. You don't know whether if your entrepreneurial venture will ever work out. And often they don't. If you look at statistically, if you look statistically at any of these ventures, they're not really all that great. Maybe education in a macro whole provides good returns, but there's many pursuits that don't, many educational pursuits that don't. And then you're left wondering at the end of it, and you don't know for 20 years, maybe even 30 years, you don't know whether the thing that you actually did was worth your time and effort. And the same thing with getting a PhD, the same thing with being an entrepreneur, the same thing with doing innovation. You don't know. And so I'm in the thick of the reciprocity project right now. I'm 8 years in, and I've learned a lot along it when I've been building this thing. I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about, you know, who is going to support and what's that going to look like. I've learned a lot of different things about the process. So I want to tell you exactly what that is. The Reciprocity Project is a platform. What I'm believe is going to be to create non-rejectable research papers and grants. And it's not just your stereotypical stuff that you're thinking about, like your spell checker or your chat GPT, but it's some sort of platform to help us walk through and to do better research. That means that there's sometimes motivational issues. There's lots of different things that are going on that are very, very complicated. And as I've been building this thing, I've heard a lot of critiques. I've also felt a lot of critiques myself. I have an internal voice in my head. And almost all of these critiques, most of them, the sort of wandering thoughts that I get are often very negative. They make me not want to do it, and I have to push back against it. And every time that I pay for something, I feel it. And I often feel very alone. I've been doing this 8 years now. And without financial support, it's me and my wife. And I have had many tearful conversations with my wife, or where I've been afraid to talk about it. And I want to talk about all of these things that I think are really important. Now, the story with that is sold in the popular press is that it's a glorious thing. And maybe we'll talk about that in one of the chapters. Is that it's a glorious thing, and you're supposed to feel really good throughout the process. The other thing that they tell you is that the whole process is this kind of joyful experience, but it's not. You go through a lot of doubtful moments, and it often doesn't feel good. And you often feel very isolated. You feel very alone. You feel like you're the only one. And you listen to or try to interpret critiques that are often incorrect. And it's challenging to process all of these things. Many people tell you all sorts of different things. And what you have to realize, and I think that's where I would love to take this book, is to realize there's no good answers. And often it's just you making the choice that best suits you, and having the determination or joy or whatever you have in your heart that represents who you actually are. Processing and listening to feedback. This feedback is sometimes in your mind. It's your internal feedback that you have, and you have an internal conversation that's going on in your mind where your ego, I can't remember what the two terms are, but there's, the conversation that you have in your mind, that which some of us have, not everybody has, but that little person in your mind that you're talking to. It's often very critical. Often it has no idea what it's talking about, and yet you try to convince yourself that person in your mind is actually all knowledgeable. And the same thing with everybody else. They give you all sorts of criticism. They give you all sorts of advice, but they haven't gone through it. They don't know what you're going through in the process. And what this does, and what this feels like, it's not what it's often purported to feel like. It feels very much that you're alone, you're afraid, you're isolated. It feels like you're doing things that are dirty or wrong. Um, all of those things. And I don't think, so I'm doing this as a side project. The Reciprocity project I thought would turn into something, and I would perhaps maybe run it one day, but it hasn't. I'm 8 years in, so I'm still doing it as a side project. It's growing in a lot, but it's still not quite there. And so even if I wasn't doing this as a side project, and this was my full-time gig, I would have those same experiences. And I would feel the same way, where I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Every negative emotion that you can imagine, you experience. Often there's anger. You feel like, the indifference that other people feel, their own self-interest. You often think about this and say, why is nobody paying attention? Why am I doing this thing and nobody is getting it? That was the big sort of aha moment when I spent a whole bunch of money and I put it out on the internet, and then nobody cares. Now, it's the same thing that you're going to do when you get a degree. There'll be 2 people or 3 people get your PhD degree that will be really excited. Maybe a couple of people and they'll be excited for one day. And then that's it. And I know that that is a very self-centered perspective, but that's how I often feel. And I think maybe some of you actually feel the same way. Um, if you go through this, you have to go through a lot of processing of how am I going to keep going? Despite the fact that it doesn't feel good, you have these negative emotions, all of these things that are very real in your life and they're very concrete. And I think the key thing, and perhaps the takeaway is to not only find yourself, but to lean into all of those things. Talk about it. Really think about how you can use that indifference that often exists to your advantage. It's not something that you should ignore, right? Like some of those things are really incredibly important. And those are signals that you should interpret and think about. Express what you are going through. I think people don't understand. Ultimately, I think they often don't understand what it entitles. So I've learned through building the reciprocity project is that it's actually often these emotions and these feelings that are the key thing. And you think of them when you're going through them and experiencing it as it's only me. When you're experiencing it, you think like, I'm just a fool feeling like this. Nobody that's doing it right is ever going to have these feelings. All of that stuff is actually the real thing. That is what we often go through. And I would love for all of you to begin this journey where you start voicing all of these things. And it's incredibly hard to do it. I don't like openly talking about these feelings because I feel ashamed and all of those things that everybody else feels. But and I feel nervous right now talking about it. I feel we're like, bleh, right? But it's an important part of the process of learning to do things that resonate with other people. Because those are the same emotions that everybody else are feeling. Those are the things that everybody else is going through. They're looking at it and they're saying, I can't do this. I'm afraid. I feel like a fool. I'm ashamed. All of those things are the things that has rarely often to do with the financial reasons. I want you to think about that in terms of this decision that we often go through, this investment decision that we go through, taking away today, which is painful, and investing in something that you don't understand. And we'll never understand until it's 20, 30, 40 years from now. So even typical investment decisions like education or investing in your retirement feel this way. And by the time you actually get there in the 30 years, you look back and you say, why didn't I do that? You think, why didn't I invest? That's because you're a completely normal human being that has all of these emotions. One of the things that we know is that looking back, you almost always see perpetual growth that's happening in many of the Western countries. Probably most countries around the world are growing quite rapidly. Many companies are growing, and yet people choose not to invest in them every single day. And why is that? It's because they're normal. They're like everybody else. They're looking at it and they're afraid. They feel silly. They don't want to ask questions. They have all of these negative emotions, or maybe they're really excited to actually do it and they're dumbfounded. I can do all of these possible things. I don't know what to do. And so they choose not to do anything. And I want you to think about this as you go about your day, as you're exploring and finding things. All of these negative emotions are real. All of these experiences that you have are real. I want you to interpret them as such, and that these are often the right signals to talk about, to experience. It's not going to be like we have this imaginary thing when people talk about feedback, for example, in the entrepreneurial process or the innovative process. There's this imaginary thing that there's feedback that's going to happen. People are going to be jumping there telling you what to do, right? Giving you feedback, guidance, or a coach or whatever, right? But that doesn't happen. It's emptiness. And maybe you get somebody that's highly critical every once in a while that really eats at you. But the feedback is the nothingness. It's the conversation that you have with the nothingness. So this book is probably going to be a little bit meandering, but I like that. And it's going to include things that, I've done research on. Sometimes it's going to include personal stories. I really want to go into who I am because I think that that is extremely important to the process of coming through this. And I'm going to um, often have not answers. I think that this is going to be very different compared to a traditional academic-y kind of book that's geared towards a practitioner audience because there's often just takeaways or answers. This is going to leave you with a lot more questions and ponderings. And I don't knows more than anything. I want that to be a meandering journey of confusion, just like what you are going to experience. The process is always ambiguous and you never quite know. And I want to communicate that. I want to share that so that you feel normal. All right. Take care and have a wonderful day.